A man stands in a courtroom, calm, almost bored. Around him, survivors are weeping, mothers, daughters, men who lost everything. And this man, Hisao Tani, shows nothing. Not guilt, not shame, not even discomfort. And that silence, that emptiness in his eyes, that was the most terrifying thing about him. In December 1937, the city of Nanjing fell. And what followed wasn't just a military defeat. It was something historians still struggle to describe in words that feel adequate. A 6-week period of mass killing, assault, and destruction, so extreme that it shocked even Nazi officials present in the city at the time. Let that sink in. Nazi officials wrote letters home calling what they witnessed unbearable. At the center of this horror stood one man with a specific role, a specific unit, and a specific level of personal accountability that a Chinese military tribunal would later spend years trying to prove. His name was Lieutenant General Hisao Tani, commander of the 6th Division of the Imperial Japanese Army. And the story of what he did, and what was done to him in return, is one of the most intense, complicated, and emotionally heavy stories in all of 20th century history. If you're new here, welcome to X History. We don't sugarcoat. We don't skip the hard parts. We tell history the way it actually happened, with real people, real consequences, and real emotion. Hit subscribe and stay with us because this one goes deep. Here's the thing: history books rarely tell you about men like Hisao Tani. They weren't born monsters. Tani was born in 1882 in Kochi Prefecture, Japan. He grew up in a country obsessed with military honor, national expansion, and the idea that a soldier's greatest virtue was absolute loyalty to the emperor. He was educated, decorated, promoted through ranks the traditional way, through years of service, discipline, and perceived competence. By the time war came to China, he was a 55-year-old general with a long career behind him. And that's what makes it worse. This wasn't a young man caught up in battlefield chaos. This was a senior commander, a man with the experience, authority, and power to stop what was happening under his command. He didn't. When Japanese forces entered Nanjing on December 13, 1937, the battle was effectively over. The Chinese army had retreated. The city had surrendered. Under every established rule of warfare and basic human decency, what should have followed was occupation, not annihilation. What happened instead became known as the Rape of Nanjing. In 6 weeks, historians estimate between 100,000 and 300,000 civilians and prisoners of war were killed. The numbers are still debated, not because the killings didn't happen, but because the scale was so massive that documentation itself became overwhelming. Women and children were not spared. Prisoners of war were executed in mass formations. Bodies filled the Yangtze River. Entire neighborhoods were burned. And Tani's 6th Division was at the center of it. Now here is the moment most documentaries skip past, and it's the most important detail in this entire story. Hisao Tani didn't just allow the massacre. Evidence presented at his trial showed that his division was directly involved in organized killings, not just individual acts of battlefield chaos, but structured, deliberate mass execution of prisoners and civilians. Some of his own soldiers testified. International witnesses, doctors, missionaries, journalists trapped in the city documented what they saw in real time. The International Safety Zone in Nanjing, set up by foreign nationals to protect civilians, recorded case after case of atrocities carried out by troops under his command. These weren't rumors reconstructed decades later. These were contemporaneous records, written in the moment, by people who had no reason to lie and every reason to be afraid. Japan surrendered in August 1945. And almost immediately, the question hanging over Asia was the same one hanging over Europe after the Nazi defeat. Who answers for this? The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, officially the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, began in 1946. But China wanted its own process, its own court, its own reckoning. Because the wounds in Nanjing weren't abstract, they were personal, they were still fresh. The Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal convened specifically to try those responsible for the massacre. And at the top of the list, the man they wanted most was Hisao Tani. Getting him wouldn't be easy. And what happened inside that courtroom would shake everyone in it. Most war criminals, when the war ends, run. They disappear into new identities, new countries, new lives built on the graves of their victims. History is full of men who escaped justice for decades, some forever. Hisao Tani did not run. And somehow, that made people angrier. When Allied forces located Tani after Japan's surrender, he wasn't hiding. He was living quietly, a retired general, going about his days as if the world hadn't spent the last 8 years burning because of men like him. He was extradited to China in 1946. And from the moment he arrived, observers noted something deeply unsettling about him. He was cooperative, polite even. He answered questions. He showed up to proceedings on time. But he never, not once, expressed genuine remorse. In interviews and court sessions, Tani maintained that what happened in Nanjing was either exaggerated or the natural chaos of war that no single commander could control. He distanced himself from specific orders. He leaned on the fog of battle as his defense. It was a strategy, and it almost worked. The Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal opened Tani's case in early 1947. The Chinese prosecution knew they had a difficult task ahead, proving individual command responsibility, that a specific general personally ordered or knowingly permitted specific atrocities, was legally complex. Defense teams in war crimes trials across the world were using the same argument. I didn't order it. I didn't know. War is chaos. But the prosecution had something most tribunals didn't. They had witnesses who were still alive. Survivors of the massacre sat in that courtroom. They weren't distant relatives reading old letters. They weren't historians interpreting documents. They were people who had been there, who had seen, survived, and carried the weight of December 1937 in their own bodies for nearly a decade. When they spoke, the courtroom changed. One by one, survivors took the stand. A woman described watching her family killed in front of her. A former prisoner of war described mass executions carried out with mechanical efficiency. Men lined up, killed in groups, their bodies pushed into the river. A missionary who had worked in the international safety zone described filing complaint after complaint with Japanese military authorities, complaints that were acknowledged, logged, and ignored. That last detail was critical, because it proved that the chain of command knew that reports of atrocities had reached officers at the command level, that someone with the authority to stop it had received the information and chose to do nothing. Tani sat through all of it. His expression, by multiple accounts, barely changed. The prosecution didn't rely on survivor testimony alone. They entered into evidence the records kept by the International Committee for the Nanjing Safety Zone, a group of foreign nationals, mostly Western, who had stayed in the city during the massacre and documented everything they could in real time. Letters, photographs, formal complaint logs addressed to Japanese military headquarters. One of the most powerful figures connected to this documentation was John Rabe, a German businessman and, controversially, a Nazi Party member, who nevertheless spent the massacre protecting as many Chinese civilians as he could and writing detailed accounts of what he witnessed. The fact that a man wearing a Nazi armband was horrified by what Japanese forces were doing in Nanjing was not lost on the tribunal. It was entered into the record, and it landed hard. Tani's defense team argued that he had limited operational control during the chaotic final push into Nanjing. They argued that individual soldiers acted without orders. They argued that the numbers cited by the prosecution were inflated. The tribunal was not persuaded. The evidence of systematic, organized killing, carried out over 6 continuous weeks, not a single day of battlefield chaos, was simply too overwhelming. The complaint logs proved command awareness. The survivor testimonies proved scale. The international documentation proved consistency. And one more thing sealed it. 2 of Tani's own subordinate officers had already been tried and convicted for their roles in the massacre. Their convictions created a legal foundation, a documented chain of atrocity running directly through the 6th Division, the unit Hisao Tani commanded. He was the man at the top of that chain. On February 6, 1947, the Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal delivered its verdict. Hisao Tani, Lieutenant General, Imperial Japanese Army, commander of the 6th Division, was found guilty of war crimes. Specifically, the ordering and permitting of mass atrocities against civilians and prisoners of war during the Nanjing Massacre. The sentence was death. The method, execution by firing squad. The date would be set within weeks. And in Nanjing, a city that had spent nearly a decade carrying wounds that never fully healed, people waited. Because a verdict on paper was one thing. Watching it actually happen was another. Between the verdict and the execution, something strange happened. Hisao Tani asked to write letters. To his family back in Japan, to former colleagues, to his children who had grown up knowing their father as a decorated general, a man of discipline and national service. What he wrote in those letters has never been fully made public, but people who knew him in those final weeks said something in him had finally shifted. Not enough, not in time, but something. While Tani sat in his cell, Nanjing was preparing. And the mood in the city wasn't simple. It wasn't pure celebration or clean-cut revenge. It was something heavier and more complicated than that. Because the people of Nanjing had spent 9 years living with the memory of what happened in December 1937. They had rebuilt homes, buried family members, raised children in the shadow of something that the rest of the world was only beginning to slowly understand. For them, this wasn't a political moment. It wasn't a legal formality. It was personal. Survivors who had testified at the trial made their way toward the execution site. Not out of bloodlust, but because after nearly a decade of carrying that December inside them, they needed to see with their own eyes that the world had finally, officially, acknowledged what happened to them. That it was real, that it mattered, that someone answered for it. The execution of Hisao Tani took place on April 26, 1947, at Yuhuarai, the terrace of rain flowers on the outskirts of Nanjing. The location was not chosen randomly. Yuhuarai had been one of the primary execution sites during the massacre itself. Thousands of Chinese civilians and soldiers had been killed there by Japanese forces in December 1937. The ground beneath it held a grief that words couldn't fully measure. Bringing Tani there was deliberate, symbolic, a closing of a circle that had been broken open 9 years earlier. Tani was brought to the site under military escort. Footage and photographs from the execution exist, grainy, black and white, deeply uncomfortable to look at. This was one of the few war crimes executions of the era that was documented visually, in part because Chinese authorities wanted an undeniable record. They had watched the world deny, minimize, and argue over what happened in Nanjing for years. They were not going to let the ending be disputed too. By multiple accounts, Tani walked to the site without being physically dragged. He was placed in position. And then it was over. A firing squad carried out the sentence. Hisao Tani, the man who had sat unmoved through weeks of survivor testimony, who had commanded a division that turned a surrendered city into a killing ground, who had gone home after the war and lived quietly while the people of Nanjing lived with nightmares, was dead. He was 64 years old. Here is where history gets complicated again, because justice, even when it arrives, doesn't erase. The Nanjing Massacre did not become a universally acknowledged historical fact overnight. In Japan, the events of December 1937 were minimized in textbooks for decades. Politicians made statements that survivors found devastating. The debate over casualty numbers, which many historians argue became a way to avoid confronting the reality of the massacre rather than genuinely engage with it, continued for years. Tani's execution was a legal conclusion. It was not a cultural one. And that gap, between what courts ruled and what societies chose to remember, is one of the most important lessons this story carries. The last direct survivors of the Nanjing Massacre are now in their final years. Some have spent their entire adult lives testifying, speaking to students, giving interviews, insisting that the world not look away. One of the most remarkable aspects of their accounts is not the anger, though that is there, real and earned. It's the insistence on being believed. Because for decades, many of them weren't. They were called exaggerators, political tools, pawns in diplomatic disputes between China and Japan, and they kept talking anyway. They kept showing up. They kept saying this happened. I was there. I need you to understand. Tani's trial and execution gave those voices a formal, legal weight. A court looked at the evidence, heard the testimony, and said, yes, this happened, and someone is responsible. That matters more than most people realize. History is not just about dates and battles and verdicts. It's about what humans are capable of in both directions. The capacity for organized cruelty on a scale that defies comprehension, and the capacity to sit in a courtroom decades later, still shaking, still speaking, still demanding that the world bear witness. Hisao Tani was executed at Yuhuara on April 26, 1947. The survivors of Nanjing watched. And the weight of that moment, a city's grief finally acknowledged, a general's impunity finally ended, is something no textbook summary can fully carry. You had to have been there. And since we weren't, the least we can do is remember. If this story moved you, if it made you think, or feel, or want to understand more, that's exactly why X History exists. Share this with someone who needs to know this story. Subscribe if you haven't already. And drop in the comments, what part of this history do you think the world has most ignored? We'll see you in the next one.